You can't rehearse something you ain't invented yet. Wayne Shorter said that. The oracle at Delphi foretold that the wooden walls would save Athens. Sounds like the oracle was an architect. But architecture doesn't generally promulgate prognosis. More conventionally, architecture sustains the present. But I promise you, someone will toss architecture into the future. Someone always does. Originality is an instinct about what's not yet built, or an intuition about how we think about what's built, or an editorial on how we think about those who think about what's built. Surprise unnerves most of us. Surprise unnerves most of us. So the architecture of the status quo rehearses only what it has learned to perform. That's the psychiatrist's logic, not the inventor's. But the architecture of experiment is predisposed to perform only what it hasn't rehearsed. Perhaps that's why the unrehearsed appears crude. We only learn as we build. Maybe you recall the name Sir Thomas More, and maybe you don't. The 16th century English chancellor, never the man of tactics, more the anti-Machiavelli, part religious advocate, part utopian ideologue, part Democrat, part author, forever a man of conscience in a world of tacticians. More lost his head to Henry VIII. His exception perpetuated only the record of his exception. The rule held. But the accolade for Sir Thomas More, the man for all seasons, endures. Then there's the case of Michael Sorkin. Still has his head, apparently. Never the man of tactics. He's an author, or an experimental architect, or an experimental building architect, or a city planner, or an educator, or an enduring intonation for a social and political conscience in architecture. According to the well-worn professional standard, pick one venue, Michael, and stick to that. But for Sorkin, the model professional is never the professional model. The one venue per architect format doesn't hold. Sorkin constructed an amalgamation of a number of disparate careers, rolled them into a ball, and tossed them into the future. Is Sorkin the exception to the rule, or is Sorkin the exception that turns the unrehearsed into a new rule? Please welcome an architect for all seasons, Michael Sorkin, to SCI-Arc.
I'm very pleased to be introduced by Eric, and I'm very pleased to be back teaching here at the world's greatest, although most overheated architectural school. What are the symptoms of this Ebola? Is it just feeling overheated? Am I going the wrong way already? So I'm in the process of captioning all my slides in Chinese, both in order to address myself to the big other, as well as to students at American architectural schools. I'm making some progress, as you'll see. Anyway, a lecture. Where's my Coke? How green is my city? The crisis is well known. Shall we rehearse some relevant facts? Global urban population is increasing by over 1 million a week. More than half the planet already lives in cities, expected to hit 3/4 by mid-century. Half of these live in slums, and the gap between rich and poor grows ever greater. Default solutions to this metastasis, megacities, sprawl, mass migration, and promiscuous location are nightmares. Cities too big are ungovernable, alienating, threatening, wasteful, unsustainable. Market-driven, bottom-line locational choices promote global social disruption and insecurity as jobs chase low wages and our urbanity pursues privilege for the so-called creative class. Finally, the planet simply cannot keep up with our rates of consumption and waste. Last year, 1.5 million Chinese died from air pollution. 1 billion people can't get a clean glass of water. Others travel miserable hours to work if they can find it. We all know some version of this grim truth. If everyone had the ecological footprint of the average American, we'd need 4 more planets right now to survive. These, of course, are not simply urban problems, but cities are distillation machines. They concentrate. If we architects and urbanists have the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath, it's to keep sight of our fundamental task, creating places that are sustainable, equitable, and beautiful. But how? To begin, we must constantly negotiate our role and our relevance. Despite our dreams, we are not the hegemons of the urban and must be wary of the top-down. Real power seldom comes our way, and Haussmann, Speer, or Moses must be renounced as models of practice. The ultimate right to the city in its form belongs to its citizens. This is a nice theory, but a thornier practice, and I certainly don't mean to suggest that we professionals are invariably subordinate. We lay down vital armatures, create the economic, intellectual, analytical, and physical circumstances for the project of the city, and must do so at a magnitude commensurate with the question and the crisis. But that our collaboration is contingent and constantly shifting shouldn't obscure what we do, nor its predicate in consent. What's clearly not needed is the turf warfare, the useless struggles that have yielded such mongrel disciplines as urban design, landscape urbanism, agricultural urbanism, ecological urbanism, and the other little hybrid academic monsters. Each of these wannabe practices does mark legitimate discontent with our historic insensitivity to morphological nuance, cluelessness about the environment, and the real meaning of social life. This anxiety is not new, and we do stand on the shoulders of giants. Whether the completely socialized ecological model of the Chicago school or the efforts to situate the natural sciences in the urban context by pioneers like Patrick Geddes, we've been circling this territory for yonks, and will continue to do so like the wise moths we are. But there is also an even more dramatic risk that the city is simply disappearing, both formally and discursively, as the actual project of urbanization takes the form of the repetitive construction of massive but commonplace infrastructures, hundreds of identical apartment towers, skyscraper-clotted central business districts, giant highways, airport-free zones. We are compelled to identify the city with another territoriality, the ubiquitous ooze that is the characteristic spatial product of neoliberal multinationalism and its global zoning. I want to urgently suggest that these phenomena, including the megacities that aggregate them, are precisely not cities. We must hold the line against an excessively formal or operational notion of what constitutes a city, the city no more than the sum of its organizational and operational infrastructures, and insist that the social, the democratic possibilities of urban space are at the core of what distinguishes the idea of the city and its practices. The city seen as the ground for participation founds another model with a powerful grip on the urban imaginary: informality, the dominant urbanism of cities in the developing world. Informality purges planning from the charge of domination by foregrounding citizenship and participation. Can we use its methods in our own planning? The question locates central issues of urban politics and empowerment. We too often have romantic and one-dimensional relationships to these places, whether based on their visual complexity, cubist compositions tumbling down the hillsides of Rio or Bogota, or more importantly, on their self-initiation, economic creativity, and tight bonds of necessity. Today's do-it-yourself and tactical urbanisms are attempts to reinvigorate community control and to gain purchase in an environment in which that damn 1% holds all the cards. How to reconcile the actual misery of squatter settlements with their communal dynamics, technical ingenuity, and open-ended formal invention without ratifying the end product. Our ambition should not be to reproduce Dharavi or Soweto as a final state, nor to assume that a permanently, if dynamic, condition of organized squalor is the best we can do for the city. The risks of relativism are too great and the results too meager. There's an image that's been making the rounds of late, the Torre David in Caracas, that is alternately interpreted as a self-enfranchising utopia or a J.G. Ballard high-rise nightmare. This spectacle stands in the highly ambiguous place once occupied by the famous walled city of Kowloon, insane in its density, romantically outlaw, a desperate, filthy riposte to the shiny, sunlit hygiene of modernist urbanism, as well as a kind of nasty Orientalist summa of the libertine degradation of the other. Simple normalization is not the answer. I'm hardly the first to argue that the answer may not be to draw their inhabitants deeper and deeper into the system, a la Hernan de Soto, by miring them in credit, bank cards, land titles, and the disabling accoutrements of capital. But it's surely critical that we do something. This begins with recognizing that a purely informal sector doesn't actually exist. The lives of those in these settlements are generally a combination of survival strategies that cross between these illusory sectors all the time, in the way people find and build housing, receive their educations, earn their livings, take their pleasures. Ananya Roy points out the extremes of the fundamentally informal arrangements used by governments to pattern settlement, to shape economic influence, and to negotiate a wide variety of corruptions. Formality and informality are conceptual ghettos, taking shape in the imaginary to reinforce and further reify a set of practices that have shifting uses. And it is to these that we must look. Whatever advances freedom and comfort and the health of the planet is a tool, a tactic, worth wielding. One of the key questions raised by both the patterns of megacities and of the informal is density. And distributing density is one of our core operations as planners and designers. Today, the question is being revisited under the reshaped sensibility of sustainability. And there's little fundamental disagreement that the suburbs and sprawl are fundamentally unsustainable, and that urban density can promote sociability, efficient infrastructure, environmental benefits, mass public transportation, and a more congenial mix of use. But we must think hard about limits. The corollary image, paralleling the famous pessimistic multiplying planets, is the putatively liberating claim that all of the world's city dwellers would fit in Texas if the entire state were built at New York densities. It's also been calculated that all of Texas would fit into Manhattan if built at Kowloon densities. Of course, there is a downside here, starting with the fact that Rick Perry and Ted Cruz would rule the world. But density is not an absolute, and many of its current enthusiasts refuse to unpack its subservience to profit, its capacity for the suppression of variety and difference, its threat to the exercise of local and individual forms of autonomy, and its ability to further mystify the relationship of the city to what used to be called nature. New York is, at the moment, stuck in a debate over several of our ex-mayor's boldest extractive gambits, including a massive upzoning around Grand Central and the erection of a billionaire's row of Empire State-scaled condos on 57th Street that will cast shadows a mile deep into Central Park on winter afternoons. Air is New York's equivalent of petroleum. Although we have come some way since the foundational doctrine of property rights of the medieval cuius est solum eius est usque ad colum et ad infernos, who owns the soil also owns up to heaven and down to hell, but not all that far, and the concept remains our conceptual default. Like the Federal Reserve, our planning department has as its main activity printing new money in the form of the right to occupy the space above us via zoning largesse. And we all know the dangers of uncontrolled inflation. But let me shift gears. I'd now like to trace a brief and somewhat polemical outline, as if I hadn't begun, of the points of intervention my own formal practice has been engaged in. One of the bugaboos of the politically correct is the so-called master plan, redolent of patriarchy, authoritarianism, insensitivity, and the hubris of every kind of overreach. The territory of expressive inquiry is too suspect. We have a tendency to look at representations of new cities and quarters in their all at once as pornography, the gaze that maligns and entraps. For many years, these representations have often come in a protective dystopian wrapper, reinforcing the idea that the visionary is ipso facto evil. I've been teaching urban design for quite a long time, and I often ask my students to make images of ideal students. There was a long and troubling period where a large percentage brought in an image from Blade Runner, The Fifth Element, or similar, images of undeniable graphic power, but clearly sinister meaning. This reflects both the incompetence and bad motives of authority and a kind of negative celebration of popular empowerment. The postmodern critique of totalizing systems of knowing, meaning, acting, and representing was founded in an appreciation of the actual diversity of being and experience, in an embrace of the qualities of the other, and in a re-understanding of the nature of equality. Moving beyond modernity's infatuation with mathematical models of social relations, a more progressive discourse imbibed the theories and the arts of difference and looked to re-identify the sources of its own diversity. In my own school days, this meant the identification of squatters and informality with a more general notion of user control, and we thought could percolate up and down the spectrum of intervention and participation. It also meant that appreciation of the complex social, economic, and formal ecologies of the historic city became far more deeply appreciated as the basis for both activism and design. I, however, thank you, Eric, grew up on utopia, and the idea of the new town conceived in the all at once has always been on my mind. My first architectural model, sometime in grade school, was of Brasilia. Unable to think of another way of constructing a dome, I used a half grapefruit for the Congress Hall, an obvious early example of my commitment to green architecture. I pawed repeatedly through Mumford's The City and History to get to the plates with the images of Wollingby. I spent 6 months on a kibbutz. My childhood was largely passed in an idyllic modernist suburb of the formidably planned Washington, D.C. I was a volunteer at that great temporary intentional community, Resurrection City. I did miss Woodstock, but was certainly part of the nation of its fellow travelers and was simultaneously immersed in the spatial politics of both the out there and the ameliorative. I worked as an advocacy planner and a minor municipal official. I was a squatter in London for a time. I was equally stimulated by Archigram and by Jane Jacobs, and I still am. I see no contradiction. Both styles of thinking are deeply relevant, and true ecological thinking always suggests expansiveness and inclusion. I'm not trying to take a moderate position here to split the difference. I want to argue that work on the city can begin anywhere where some heart and mind-felt certainty is to be found. I believe that neither the dominant deductive style of planning, we begin with a general program, proceed to a morphological frame, and finally get down to the doorknobs, nor the more open-ended inductive style, start with a memory of a sunny day in Venice or Cartagena, or with some form that insistently insinuates itself into your sketchbook. The process must be dialectical, mutually interrogatory, a framework that applies not simply to questions of scale and direction, but also to styles of participation. Equity demands the most fluid and varied forms of both imagination and representation. I'm now going to show you 4 projects, one from 1994, one from 2010, and 2 others current. These occupy different conceptual spaces, but all deals with questions of urban autonomy. In two cases via the creation of new cities, the first fantastical, and the second and the third more conventional, and in the final through the retrofit of an existing city. They're all projects that are represented in a projective all at once, indispensable as stimulus and as propaganda for possibility. Of course, we are effectively creating new cities all the time. China is doing it in the old-fashioned way, finding empty sites, constructing massively, planning a long march of urbanization that will move 250 million people into towns in the next 10 years. Such accelerated single-form construction has historically been typical of the US too, where suburban sprawl and its reformulation as edge city have created new patterns of movement and distribution of uses, but little change in density, inefficiency, or alienation. However, that the future of the city is unpredictable should not discourage us from speculation about the right now. Too much contingency yields an oppressive uncertainty. Too little simply imprisons. Weed, Arizona, is a project for the design of a new city on a small part of an existing military base near Yuma, Arizona. Sited along an artificial lake on the lower Colorado River, Weed embodies a set of motherhood issues that characterize all our work on city design and are the bedrock of sustainable urbanism. To begin, the town is car-free, vehicles relegated to the periphery with benign means, walking the alpha, used for internal circulation. To enable this, the town is strictly bounded, edges fixed. Its structure is based on a series of neighborhood-scaled increments based on a 10-minute walking radius, or 20 minutes from the desert edge to the water edge, that locates both centers and other distributed facilities and public spaces, a basic unit of accountancy for complete neighborhoods. Beyond that, the organization is, to put it mildly, complex, and enables, among other things, one of the salient opportunities of the good urban life, getting lost. Despite their somewhat wild appearance, what am I saying? This is SCI-Arc. The drawings for Weed are meant to be read as precisely as possible and are drawn to scale. The map of differences is authoritative, suggesting both size and variety. Thus, while we don't specify what the meaning of the different shades of blue and green might be, ornamental garden, constructed wetland, picnic ground, swimming hole, fish farm, we do propose a highly particular density of difference. It should be clear that the remix of green, blue, and built spaces represents a fairly radical divergence with contemporary practice, dramatically skewed greenish. The architecture may be strange, but it's also precise. Weed is imagined as a loft based on a kind of architectural stem cell, space without assigned use, but ready to assume any. This is not exactly far-fetched. Not simply has the discourse of flexibility and what used to be called equipotentiality been a staple of late modernist fantasies about architecture, the experience of the post-industrial city, as well as the informal one, have shown increasing possibilities for a flexible, dramatically mixed distribution of uses, as well as the imperatives of reuse. The discourse of the loft that arose in the 60s and 70s was a collusion of two distinct, if related, streams. The first was the more ideological-driven idea of flexibility that found its most dramatic expression in buildings like the Beaubourg Center, where the animating fantasy was one of subdivision, the idea that from a very large and essentially undefined space with services near at hand, a variety of more bespoke environments could be carved. This essentially paralleled the discovery of loft living in abandoned urban industrial zones, most classically Soho in New York, where the occupation of former factories became a kind of beau ideal for the artistic life, rich with implications of freedom, abundance, and the recovery of the righteous vibe of a vanished industrial class. In both cases, though, architectures that appeared flexible proved rigid and far less tractable than touted. In the case of enormous buildings like the Beaubourg, not to mention the giant floor-plated office buildings still typical of corporate America, the very vastness of the space and the long distances to its daylit perimeter were efficient only according to a soulless bureaucratic model. Likewise, the much smaller lofts of Soho were constrained by the limitations of their original construction. Party wall buildings with decent light at one end and not much more than an air shaft at the other, they worked well unsubdivided, but failed when their action painter inhabitants spawned human offspring and required private spaces, extremely difficult to provide with adequate light and air. Weed investigates an idea about lofts that do not find differentiation via subdivision, but through aggregation. The notion is that spaces can be more particular, more individual, if the medium from which they are produced is not overwhelmingly simple, but more complex, more resistant, yielding variegated spaces and provoking unexpected opportunities. But these spaces of unspecified use but open potential can be designed with precise characteristics. One of the arguments of the project is that architecture and the city find their basic forms and sizes in relationship to the fundamental needs of the body and of sustainability. This range of human dimensions and their environmental requirements are not obscure. We conduct our activities face to face, and our spatial needs and habits of both conjunction and isolation have been developed down the millennia. Buildings designed for daylight and cross-ventilation, the bedrock of sustainable architecture, will fall within a narrow range of lengths and widths, and the drawings for Weed speculate about a number of configurations for flexible and sustainable, yet resistant and complex forms of inhabitation. This embraces both plan and section. In a city organized around the primacy of human locomotion, buildings will tend, as they were from the dawn of architecture to the end of the 19th century, to be low and accessible by foot power. In general, this means a default of about 5 stories. Having spent 26 years living on the top floor of a 5-story walk-up building, I can verify that extensive empirical research reveals that this is pretty much the upper limit for the regular climbing of stairs by middle-aged Americans. The body-based, sustainable city will thus tend to be both dense and low. So much about the fundamental physical requirements of such a city is easily derived. It's possible to offer a wide variety of solutions to its design based simply on common sense, a logic that simultaneously tests form, use, and respiration. Of course, the city will always abound with special uses, and Weed has a zone of theaters and entertainment, seen here, where the buildings of larger dimensions are integrated with a texture of smaller structures. This compatibility of sizes is surely one of the key lines of morphological research for new cities in general, and a variety of centers at different scales and different characters. Although the forms may be somewhat eccentric, many of these places are designed recollectively. All architecture, after all, mixes memory and invention, and evoke in proportion, dimension, materiality, or feeling some touchstone for successful place-making, and fix the system of taste of their authors. While you may not precisely feel the souks of Fez, the Piazza Navona, or the canals of Suzhou, they've registered indelibly on me as places of pleasure, practicality, and harmony. Urbanism's aspiration must always also be spatial, whatever other contingencies it seeks to satisfy. Still, the notion that a city can be designed in some detail without precise programming and zoning is something we continue to investigate. Zoning, after all, is an artifact of the 19th century, a product of the rise of the industrial city. Although cities have always been zoned, in the isolation of royal or sacred quarters, or the communal flourishing of the districts of guilds or crafts, the creation of enormous classes of activities and people considered obnoxious is the result of the ecology of industrial capitalism. Smoke-belching factories, fatal rail lines, and the restive concentrations of the working class had to be managed spatially for both efficient production and policing. Our cities remain slaves of these tactics and of their specific architectures, infrastructures, and social and spatial relations. Weed, like much of our work, investigates the morphological implications of a newly liberated situation, one in which zoning has lost its primary rationale. The twin imperatives of keeping foul uses and dangerous classes in isolation are now undercut by the prospect of clean production, service-oriented urban economies, tolerance for the presence of the other, and a recognition of the decisive role cities play in planetary ecology. However, while this post-industrial condition has enormously reduced the need for maniacal differentiation that undergirds the idea of the loft city, the idea of STEM space must be understood critically as a concept with real downside risks, a potential threat to local and individual identity. Thinking about the many new cities, the many new ecological cities we must build, not to mention the retrofit of existing places, we're challenged to find the sources of their particularity. Rejecting both the global branding strategies of corporatist urbanism and the twee nostalgia of an architecture and urbanism that continues to insist that culture abides eternally uninflected in historic forms, we must look for fresh combinations that yield new particulars. Obviously, this begins with living cultures and habits, vital connections between urban form and lives led differently, whether in Savannah, Santiago, or Shanghai. Ecological cities will be irresistibly shaped by the specifics of their bioclimatic and topographical situations, refusing the still dominant paradigm of sealed, uniform, space capsule architecture predicated on a fundamentally paranoid reading of the environment as the source of discomfort and toxic dread, whether from Al-Qaeda, Ebola, or the breeze wafting in from Fukushima. Weed is also an argument for another source of particularity, artistic invention. As local cultures find themselves under increasing duress, originalities of vision must play an increasingly important role. This doesn't mean that every city must be wacky, but it does suggest an unusually liberated situation and that the relationship between freshness and consent is open to new and to numerous approaches. This is utopian in that it imagines both fresh forms of architecture and urbanism and fresh forms of linkage between building and civic cooperation. But it's also insistently not so. It does not seek to universalize its architecture, to idealize human subjectivity, or to create, as architects and not merely modernists have been wont to do, a one-size-fits-all form of inhabitation and settlement. One weed might possibly be delightful. A world of them would surely be a nightmare. For better and worse, China's ambition is matchless, and so is much of the logic of its current course of development. Confronted with runaway urban growth, official policy includes the construction of new towns, a strategy indispensable not simply to the future of Chinese urbanism, but to world urban life in general. At the level of policy, this is tremendously enlightened. At the level of implementation, the jury is still out, and most urban building in China continues to be super-blocked, single-use, highly uniform, and too focused on the car. The projects I'm about to show you are meant, among other things, as course correction for this trajectory, and both won first place in competitions. We continue to check Google Earth to see whether they've been built. These designs are for a satellite city in the orbit of Wuhan, which recently passed a population of 10 million, and for a smaller, more functionally limited new development on the other side of town. Located along the Yangtze, historically subject to flooding, now attenuated by the construction of the Three Gorges Dam, and formerly an inland treaty port with the typical proto-Disney theme park organization into concessions for the colonial powers, Wuhan is a buzzing confusion of demolition and construction, at once disorderly and maniacal. Consolidating growth rather than endlessly manufacturing sprawl is rational. The site for the new town and its projected population of 500,000 lies at the southwest edge of the city, in a large and largely untouched territory dominated by a lovely array of lakes with waters yet a little polluted. Although development is underway around its edges, much of the western portion of the site remains agrarian, a division reinforced by a bifurcating major highway running north-south. The site perimeter is built up on its eastern, a concentration of academic and automotive production, northern, administrative facilities, and southern borders. To the west, there remains the hope that an existing green belt can be preserved and fingered into the new town. We sought, as always, to design a city that is as fully harmonized. Somebody check my Chinese spelling, please. As fully harmonized as possible. A place that not simply does the accountancy, but provides the resources for its own sustainability. To this end, we proposed an environment of 8 harmonies: air and climate, food, building, energy, movement, water, waste, and biodiversity. We attempted to embody these both via the design of the city's form and in a series of suggestions for the regulatory framework that would govern the city's respiration, the character of its building, and the deployment of its systems. We firmly believe in the creative use of codes to stimulate not simply regulation, but invention. The idea was not simply to provide a responsible infrastructure of supply, but also to make major reductions on the side of demand, to shrink the city's footprint before making sure that it was shod. 2 big moves initiated the project. The first was to reinforce the existing division of the site by that highway by concentrating development to the east and dedicating the western half to the farming of food and energy, including solar, wind, and biomass. The second was to determine the territory of the buildable via rigorous analysis of site hydrology, and hydrology is destiny, wind movement, and green connections. These are foundational, and careful consideration was especially important in this place, so blessed and vexed by water. Not simply were we interested in water capture for agrarian and domestic use, we wished to assure that the cleanliness of the lakes was enhanced, that any water that entered them was of a higher quality than what was there already. Thus, numerous constructed wetlands are strategically located along watercourses to cleanse all runoff before it enters the lake. The second project, for a mixed-use research park, is equally sensitive hydrologically on a site also subdivided by highways, and we've applied the same criteria to organizing the relationship to the lovely lakes and have kept most development on the south side of the site. The basic organization of both projects is polycentric, a series of semi-autonomous districts or neighborhoods, each seeded with particular programmatic activity determined in part by off-site adjacencies and plans and decisions already underway, as well as by sensitivity to existing natural structures and processes. In the large city, these focused respectively on administration, higher education, entertainment, and commerce. And each of these sub-districts is large enough to satisfy both practical and notional requirements for everyday neighborhood and urban life, and all are joined by efficient public transportation, including trams and buses, which provide internal links and connect to the Wuhan subway system, which skirts the edge of the site. The city is intended to be morphologically of a piece, with consistent gradients of density, a reliable and harmonized mix of uses and people, and with tractable dimensions. The central commercial district was our main focus, and its outlines are determined by concentration of density away from the water. The relatively linear form of the site, an idea about maximizing built mass at the center with a declining gradient towards the edges, the formation of potential neighborhoods in relationship to transit, and an idea about a high level of mix throughout, of use, architecture, people, and atmospheres. As with many projects, the design of individual buildings is both notional and specific, and we assume that good cities must always be the product of many hands. What we've drawn is meant to be volumetrically reliable, the translation of floor area ratio into a three-dimensional area, a three-dimensional envelope, and to set a kind of a mood, perhaps not this one. The same is true of the second big district that we've designed for this city, intended for an entertainment complex, yielding an inevitable component and character. The forms grow out of the same stable of basic ideas about scale, mix, sustainability, and locality, but the particulars of the site yield a pattern that is sufficiently different from its sibling just to the north. Distributed around the lakes are a series of water villages, miniature Sino-Portofinos, that offer another lifestyle opportunity and are linked by ferries. Finally, and these slides are missing, we suggested something of what the lowest site densities might look like, a low-rise morphology that might appear both as an edge condition or as an intermediate one embedded in higher density. We suggested as well that there be a locally manufactured system of electric cars, both for travel beyond the site and to serve as a storage medium for the local energy farms. Each of the urbanized areas is dimensioned and regulated to assure a quick walk from edge to edge and easy access both to the waterside and to greenery, and is structured by that 10-minute walking radius from a transit stop and local center, an approach that also serves to stimulate the organization of neighborhoods within districts. Jobs, commerce, and public facilities are also harmonized such that the population can be supported within the city as a matter of accountancy, if not of fact. There's also a strong effort to support morphological variety and a consistent attention to the nature of the seams between what is built and what is not, sometimes manifested in a low-density interface and sometimes in a harder edge. Access to the water is easy for everyone. Much the same attitude should be clear in our smaller project across town. This project struck us in some ways as compensatory for a bizarre zoning decision on the part of the municipal authorities to locate chemical works directly beside the river and to preserve green space and locate this ecological research center within it. We took the challenge seriously and began with rigorous analysis of soils, water, wind, indigenous species, and prized scapes. We looked at the highways both as an unavoidable blot and as a feature to be embodied in a relatively relaxed way, something that was just there. And we tried to manage circulation to both minimize cars on site and to create an autonomous system, the pedestrian spine that links the villages, that was both a connective and a social space. Given the vagueness of the program, we designed the villages relatively generically, committed to footprint, mass, orientation, and transparency, but essentially non-committal about an architecture we are not likely to control. Last project. Pause that refreshes. For the past 6 or 7 years, Terraform, the nonprofit research center, I was about to say direct, but I think the real word is subsidize, has been engaged in a thought experiment. New York City Steady State is an alternative master plan that investigates how autonomous the city might become, to see how close to coterminous we can make its ecological footprint and its political boundaries. The idea for this exercise formed a dozen years ago when I taught a seminar in urban sustainability at City College. We began with exercises using the so-called ecological footprint to clarify the metrics of urban respiration and reach, and the class took measurements both of its own ecological footprints and of various activities and phenomena in the city. This always yielded striking results, and students were suitably abashed at how much of the planet's surface was necessary to produce a Big Mac, a pair of jeans, electric light in the studio, or a ride to the beach. While this was usefully provocative, it wasn't sufficiently specific, and we began to look at the actual inputs and outputs of these processes. This literalization via mapping, tabulation, and extrapolation of the real nature and sites of production and consumption gave rise to a broader question. What would it mean to literally take responsibility for all the elements required to sustain us, not as an abstraction, but as a fact of daily life? What would it mean to, in effect, actualize the model of import substitution, to think about the city as a bounded system fully obliged to take care of itself? This fantasy was resonant both as a model of sustainability and as a proposition about local collective autonomy. The predicate of New York City steady state thus became the test of complete self-sufficiency. By pushing to the maximum, we elevated the idea of the independent city as an increment of organization and resistance in a globalizing and indifferent system, and as a source of both architectural form and social practice. We've now completed enough work to demonstrate, among other things, that it's possible to feed the current population of the city of New York a nutritionally sound diet with food grown entirely within its boundaries. However, the environmental, economic, political, cultural, culinary, and morphological arguments for doing this are complex and often completely defy anything that might be called practicality. While our study is, as always, infused with a romantic utopian aroma, it is also a well-calibrated instrument for testing the modalities and efficiencies of environmental autonomy at many sites and sizes. Small is not necessarily beautiful. There can be economics of scale, and we're not unconscious of various forms of comparative advantage. But societies and economies are always bounded, and New York City steady state examines the fantasy of autarky and a series of logics of the local. We look to an idea about cost-benefit in the environment that's not based in purely economic arguments, the algorithms of capitalist realism. For example, the question of food miles is often reflexively understood as a metric in defense not simply of localism, but of a minimized carbon footprint. But a giant cargo ship of containerized apples slowly sailing from New Zealand has a far smaller footprint per apple than a fleet of aging pickup trucks conveying hand-hewn wooden crates of Jonagolds from upstate New York to the co-op in Bushwick. However, fresh, hand-grown apples have other advantages which are irreducible to a matter of carbon. Our research is organized by respiratory function, those harmonies again, and deal with food, water, air and climate, waste, manufacture, energy, movement, and building. Each of these has strong economic, social, and political implications, and their very porous boundaries create complex interactions with the others. We began with a focus on food. Urban agriculture is a subject of much discussion these days, and obviously fundamental to survival. And it has the added appeal of certain challenging improbability in the context of the densely built city. Most of the images that I will present now are from our alimentary investigations. We're now just about done with this first volume and have demonstrated that from a purely spatial standpoint, it is possible to produce enough food for 8.5 million people to have at least 2,000 nutritious calories each day within the city. Our work has investigated sites for production at every scale, including buildings, transformed streets, repurposed infrastructure, existing open spaces, and vertical farms. This latter type, constructed in their thousands, would be indispensable to full self-sufficiency. However, such vertical systems, the sine qua non of maximized urban agriculture, require enormous investment, recast the skyline, are incapable of producing many foods in appropriate quantities, and can be radically impractical. The primary impediment to a genuinely sustainable system of vertical agriculture turns out to be not space, but the extremely high energy inputs needed for illumination and heating, as well as for the massive initial construction, including energy embodied in its materials. Although enough 30-story agricultural towers using advanced hydroponic, aeroponic, and other minimalist cultivation techniques could be built to supply the city with food, indeed several steps above Soylent in quality, on 2% of New York's total land area, a photovoltaic array sufficient to supply them would require an area 3.5 times the total surface area of the city, about 750,000 acres. Alternatively, 28 nuclear power plants would do the job, but this does seem somewhat contrary to the spirit of the exercise. Recognizing the impracticality of this arrangement, we've begun to examine a series of sweet spots that are more aligned with closing neighborhood loops that utilize viable amounts of energy, reasonable construction investment, and available land, and always honor the right to remain of existing people and communities. We've investigated a variety of morphological transformations at every scale that would characterize a city committed to autonomy and the idea that urban respiration begins locally. One of the speculations that we've pursued, this came up in the review today, interestingly enough, is the figure ground switch, in which the 19th century block pattern sees its built mass migrate into the space of the street, freeing the block interiors for agriculture and other public uses. In its first iteration, this inversion was largely directed to questions of movement and of the public realm, to strategies for reconfiguring the ratio of public to private space in the city. We've been looking for an outcome that would combine the modernist fantasy of living in greenery with a more historic idea of the central importance of the street. This new pattern is one in which urban circulation has been radically transformed, with streets largely removed from the automobile system and to a degree from any form of circulation, with a mix of pedestrians, bikes, trams, buses, and relatively few small, slow, non-emitting vehicles, what some people call complete streets. These were imagined as at once post-automotive and pre-modern, and a particular inspiration was the medieval and the Islamic city. But when we first tried out this maneuver, we saw it too simply. In that initial sketch of a pure figure ground switch, the morphology is attractive, but the real potential for intensive food production is in fact very small. We had simply plunged in, devoting too little time to the actual metrics of sufficiency. The relationship of the new morphologies to the needs and numbers of existing populations and to the production of useful amounts of food. We soon realized that even if we devoted all of the new terraced rooftops and interior courtyards to agriculture, the harvest was insufficient to feed more than about 3% of the encompassed population. A more precise investigation of several blocks in Sunnyside, Queens, seen here, revealed the dilemmas. We began to look at the transformation with a basic assumption. The population of the blocks under study must remain constant, and the area of calculation would not exceed the dimensions of the streets and blocks under combination. So we began by testing this 100% scheme, which does have a stimulating, somewhat Kowloon-like urban flavor. The densities and architectural relationships in section and the contrast between the narrowed streets and the expansive interiors is great. But the vertical farms present their usual problems. The density of the towers compromises efficient insulation at lower levels. This does not preclude food production on these floors, but means that energy inputs for artificial illumination are substantially increased. One solution is to employ the lower portions of the towers for other uses. Another, of course, is to have fewer towers. both reduce on-site capacity to grow food. So we finally settled on this scheme to produce about 30% of the food requirement on-site, which yielded a far more gracious proposition. The nature of the steady-state economy reveals itself in the calculations that lead to this. Adding residential units to the site means that housing can be subtracted elsewhere in the city. This is useful in remodeling parts of New York that are built at suburban densities and still heavily dependent on cars. Energy isn't entirely fungible. It's tied to the site of its thermodynamic conversion, whether in a car, an AC unit, or a light bulb. Using additional energy to up food production has implications for citywide conservation and production strategies. And if most of the food is coming from off-site, this ramifies in bigger strategies for provisioning the city as a whole. In the Queens case, the switched blocks are adjacent to one of the very large vertical farm complexes we're proposing, this one above the vast Sunnyside rail yards, which is near enough to be part of any local aggregation and disaggregation schemes. In the same spirit, this area here might be used for solar arrays to power the vertical farms, or simply to plug into the increasingly autonomous city grid. We've now looked at many specific architectures and solutions and have designed prototype vertical farms for both crop and animal production, various smaller scale greenhouses, wall systems, and other elements of what is now a fairly well-developed repertoire of agrarian resources. We've looked at the way in which these structures and techniques can be integrated into the fabric of the city, and have been particularly interested in the reclaiming of the space of the street from an automobile-dominated movement culture for a broader mix of public uses, including such immobile examples as agriculture. We've looked at all scales, from window boxes to skyscrapers, in order to suggest a system in which production is not monopolized by the urban equivalent of the agribusiness the whole project implicitly critiques. We're perfectly aware of how tempting a target millions of square feet of municipally developed automated vertical farms might be for Archer's, Daniels, Midland, or Monsanto. We've also investigated scenarios for reconfiguring the city as a whole to allow it to grow 100% of its food supply. Part of our primary interest here is in teasing out what will be genuinely new in the organization of radically sustainable cities. The main means of production in this citywide scheme include large areas of vertical farms, particularly in portions of the city that are currently built at suburban densities, figure ground switches, overbuilding of highways and rail infrastructures, and intensive utilization of rooftops, vacant lots, brownfields, and other available spaces. However, our larger reimagining of the city is based on an intensification of neighborhood autonomy. Our objective is to scale self-reliance down wherever possible, and a strong preference for local accountability in all aspects of urban respiration, from energy to sewage. Our drawings of the whole of New York reorganized are diagrammatic. We don't, for example, imagine a literal circular morphology for these transformed neighborhoods. But we do intend their recalibration on the basis of walk time and the emergence of a green supergrid as a zone of circulation, agriculture, climate control, recreation, water management, and organization. We're also in the process of designing a repurposed subway system to facilitate not simply the movement of people, but of goods. But we're also looking at larger scaled sweet spots and have studied a scheme for 30% production of food within the city, a scheme for a 100-mile agricultural radius, and another for a statewide system that would utilize a revived Erie Canal as its main armature of distribution. We anticipate that the completion of this study will take us another 5 years. Inshallah, I will live this long, and that we'll be able to demonstrate the very high degree to which it actually is possible to radically ratchet up the autonomy of the city. The encyclopedia of technologies and morphologies that are emerging from the work are meant to offer a practical lexicon for the global transformation of cities and the broader assumptions of urban culture about the nature of human autonomy that must increasingly characterize a planet alert to its limits and moved to deal both with distributive justice and with our very survival. Cherchez.